Chapter 3 Song in the Shadows. Even though Myra had seen the boys battling each other, she still found it hard to believe that they could have inflicted such horrible wounds with only wooden swords and blunted spears. Over 600 of the 2,000 combatants had badly bleeding wounds that would need either stitches or magic to mend. Others had broken bones, while one boy had had his left eye gouged out by a blunted arrow. Myra had felt sick seeing this and had been forced to look away. She had been helping Tiller tend to their wounds for the past hour. Her magic was proving to be very useful. Currently she was closing a very nasty gash that ran the whole length of one boy's forearm. As the flesh knitted itself back together, she tried to put him at ease with small talk. "Do you get into fights like that often?" she asked. The boy, who was a member of the tribe of Boers, gazed back at her with a puzzled look and said, "Beklager, jeg vet ikke hva du ser." Myra realized that the boy didn't speak her language. She continued to heal him silently, reasoning that any further words would be pointless. When she was done, she turned to go, but then he said something to her. "Tak," he said with a smile. "I'm sorry," said Myra. "Tak," the boy repeated. "I don't know what that means," Myra said as she turned to look for Tiller. She spotted her a little distance away wrapping a bandage around the bloodied head of another boy and called to her. "Tiller, what does tak mean?" Tiller turned towards her and called back, "It means thank you." "Ah, okay," Myra said, more to herself than to anyone in particular. After a moment she asked, "What's your people's word for your welcome?" "It's Versagod," Tiller answered as she finished applying the bandage. Myra turned back to the boy and uttered the word. He smiled and nodded his head. "I assume I said it right," she said. The boy smiled and nodded again. Myra looked up at the hot sun that burned overhead and wiped the sweat off her brow. She still found it hard to believe that she was actually in the middle of a desert. The sanctuary was so green and fertile, while the sand dunes beyond the protective ring of mountains were so parched and lifeless. She shielded her eyes from the sun and frowned. She had only spent a day out in the desert when she had first arrived in the endless sands, but that was enough to convince her that crossing the vast expanse of sun-scorched dunes would be very arduous. She heard the boy say something, and when she looked down she saw that he was offering her his canteen. Tak," she said as she took the flask. "Versagod," the boy chuckled. Myra's throat was very dry. Before she could stop herself she drank every last drop of water. She smiled sheepishly when she handed it back to the boy. "I'm sorry," she winced. "Ikke bekom radaig, det my meri elven," the boy replied. Myra turned to find another wounded boy but stopped when she saw Daniel was walking up to her. He had taken his helmet off so that she could recognize him. He looked dreadful. He had a black eye and nasty-looking cut on the bridge of his nose. His dark hair was disheveled and sleek with sweat. "Need any help?" he asked her when he was close. "No, but I think you do," she replied as she lifted her hand to his face. Daniel hesitated for a moment before he let Myra place her fingertips on him. His cut was healed almost instantly. When Myra took her hand away she drew in a sharp breath and cradled it. She had absorbed so much pain in the last hour that she thought that her hands were going to fall off at the wrists. Her fingers were sore and stiff while the palms and backs throbbed with a horrid burning sensation. "Are you all right?" asked Daniel. Myra had sat down on the ground and was looking at her hands. "Give me a minute," she replied, "the pain will go away in a little while." "You look like my sister during the war," said Daniel. Myra looked up at him as she recalled the Agro-Sulian War. At the onset of the conflict she and Daniel had been sent away for their protection, while all those who were of legal age had been conscripted into defending the Confederation. Beatrice had been studying medicine before the war, and thus she had been recruited into the militia's Mobile Field Hospital Corps. Neither Beatrice nor Jason spoke much about those days, but Myra remembered finding a photograph of them taken during the war. Both her legal guardian and Daniel's elder sister had looked hopelessly tired and dirty. "Do Daniel and I look like that now?" she wondered as he knelt beside her. "Does it really hurt?" he asked as he looked at her hands. "Yes, a lot," winced Myra as another jolt of pain stabbed through her digits. "I think you're done healing for the day," said Daniel. "You can't tell me what to do," snapped Myra, a little more harshly than what she had intended. "Myra, look at you," said Daniel, "you've been at this for an hour and you look as though you're going to keel over." "But they need my help," Myra said, motioning to the boys who lay wounded and groaning all around them. "Don't worry about them," said Daniel. "Crest and Eric tell me that they're used to being banged up like this. Isn't that right?" This last statement was directed to the boy whose arm Myra had healed. "Yeah," the boy replied with a nod, having no idea to what he was agreeing to. "You see," Daniel said to Myra, "they beat up each other like this all the time." "Not like this, Daniel," said Tiller as she approached them. "What do you mean?" asked Myra. "What I mean is," replied Tiller, "that Algar and all his former fur mates have broken an old law. When Crest won the home gang, that should have been the end of it. If Algar had followed the verdict of the duel, then none of this would have happened." "What's going to happen to Algar?" asked Daniel. "I honestly don't know," answered Tiller. "No one has ever defied the home gang like this before." "No one?" asked Myra. "Absolutely no one," replied Tiller. "The home gang is sacred and not to be taken lightly." "I'm glad I'm not Algar," said Daniel. Carla and Emmett had been separating the boys by their fur since the battle had ended. It was easy enough to disarm them of their wooden weapons, since not one of them had the strength to resist the chieftains. A tall heap of wooden swords, clubs, blunted spears, longbows and shields lay on the ground between the two groups of boys. Carla and Emmett traded glances at one another and shook their heads. The boys weren't the only ones who in trouble. Since they were the highest-ranking adults who were present when the battle started, it should have fallen on them to stop it before it could begin. The numerous parents of the wounded boys would demand answers, and both chieftains dreaded the inevitable confrontations. "So, Emmett, which of us will be the luckless lamb?" asked Carla. "What do you mean?" replied Emmett. "I mean, which of us will be the one to explain this to Algar's kin?" said Carla. "Oh, come now, Carla," scoffed Emmett, "old Arngir isn't that bad." "Bah!" growled Carla, "you only say that because he is your great-uncle." Great-great-great-great-granduncle actually," corrected Emmett, "and no, I'm not just saying that because he is my kin. He and I were never close. The only thing that cantankerous old cack of a man is close to is his spear and pride," rumbled Carla. "That cantankerous old man, as you call him, has more victories to his name than your esteemed father and both grandfathers put together," replied Emmett. "That's because they didn't go out looking for fights," snarled Carla. "Arngir's name has become a byword for glory hound, and you know it." "Do I hear a hint of venom in your voice?" asked Emmett. "And what if you do?" growled Carla. "I dare say that I have a right to it." "You're not still angry about Timberland Grove, are you?" laughed Emmett. Carla turned on him, his teeth bared in a bear-like growl. The big Arthurian loomed up over his friend and glared hard at him. "He hunted me," spat Carla. "He made me run for my life for 3 days and nights." "Carla," Emmett began, "I was never so frightened before in my life." Carla continued, "Curse that man. And curse my kin for not taking revenge." "Carla, you were only a little boy," said Emmett. "Arngir was only trying to scare you. He'd never would have hurt you. Besides, you were trespassing on his land." "I didn't know the land was his," snapped Carla. "It was so foggy that I'm honestly surprised that Arngir found me at all. I didn't mean to trespass." "Nevertheless you did," said Emmett, "and you were chased off his land as a result." "I wasn't chased off," rumbled Carla. "I was hunted. He set his wolfhounds on me and his men nearly speared me. I can still hear their horns in my sleep. And yet you evaded him and escaped with your life." Emmett chuckled. "Shame, you would have made rather a nice trophy over the fireplace." Emmett laughed. Carla growled and turned away, facing eastward. The big Arthurian looked out over the horizon and saw a dozen riders trotting towards them. They were too far to make out who they were, but when Carla caught sight of their banner his face turned pale. "Snack om Jevelin, Sar skal han ducker op," he said as he watched Arngir and his sons and elder grandsons approach them. "Ah, uncle, what a pleasant surprise," exclaimed Emmett, not meaning a word of it. "We were just coming to see you." Arngir reined in his horse and stared down at the two chieftains. His head was small and sat atop a long craning neck. He was bald on the top of his scalp while the rest of his skull was covered in coarse white hair. He had a long hooked nose that dominated his hawk-like face. His eyes, though old and dim, were keen and quick-sighted. A green tattoo of a serpent was inked across his face, going along under each eye and across the bridge of his nose. His mouth was small and rough like a slashed piece of dried leather. The corners of his lips curled up into a smile. "Really, great nephew?" he asked in a harsh and nasally voice. "I would have thought that your companion would have turned tail and run back to his hills at the mere rumor of my coming." Carla growled at the old Arthurian. Arngir smirked and turned back to Emmett. "Well, no matter," he said with a leathery smile. "Where's Algar? I wish to congratulate him on his victory." I am sorry, granduncle, replied Emmett, but you are mistaken. What do you mean? Asked Arngeir. What he means is that Algar didn't win the conquest, said Carla, stepping forward. Didn't win? Said Arngeir. How? He was beaten by Crest, smirked Carla. He and his fur took Algar's fort by storm with the help of Amaron back there. The big Arthurian thumbed at the great grey dragon over his shoulder. Your great-grandson claimed that Crest had cheated his way to victory by using the dragon, explained Emmett. And he would be right by making such a claim, spat Arngeir. That's against the laws of the fur. You know, that's exactly what Algar said, mocked Carla. We couldn't decide how to judge the conquest, said Emmett, so we decided that a homegang would be the best course of action. They fought and Crest won, boomed Carla, thumping his chest with pride. He threw your boy right off the mat. Oh, how I wish that you could have seen it. Even you would have cheered Crest on. I highly doubt that, said Arngeir. However, said Emmett, your great-grandson wouldn't accept the verdict of the duel. He defied the homegang. He what? Cried Arngeir, genuinely shocked. He and his whole fur rebelled, said Carla. Algar even attempted to murder Crest. I hope he succeeded, Arngeir muttered under his breath. He came very close, uncle, said Emmett. Where is he? Where's my great-grandson? Demanded Arngeir. Carla turned and blew a shrill whistle towards Crest, Eric and Daniel. Bring him over here, he called as he turned back to Arngeir. The three boys placed Algar on a makeshift stretcher consisting of 2 spears and their 3 shields. They carried him up to the adults and placed him on the ground before them. Both Algar's head, lower abdomen and both of his hands were wrapped in bloodied bandages. He was covered in dirt and numerous bleeding welts. He was barely conscious and mumbled incoherently between pained rasping coughs. Arngeir's eyes widened at the sight of his great-grandson's condition, his nostrils flaring as he sucked in air. Anger grew within him. Look what's happened to my poor boy, he thought as he shifted his gaze to Crest, Eric and Daniel. The 3 youths suddenly felt very afraid. One of the old Arthurian's companions leapt off his horse and dashed to Algar's side. He knelt next to him with a cry of horror. My son, they have murdered you, he cried as he scooped Algar up in his arms. The battered boy let out a pained moan as his father carried him back to his steed. Take him back to his mother and sisters, Arngeir said to the man. I should never have let him to join the fur, the man lamented as he placed Algar astride his horse. As he took his place behind his son, Emmett walked up to them with a grim look on his face. Remember this day, little cousin, because you will never live it down. It shall hound you for the rest of your days or until you redeem yourself, he said to Algar. The boy was only partially aware of Emmett's words. His world had been reduced to a blurry, muffled mass of vague images and ringing ears. Poor Algar's head pounded from the inside out and his side felt as though it were on fire. He gazed blankly at Emmett and coughed up a mouthful of bloodied spittle. You shouldn't move him, cried Tilla when she looked up from her latest patient. She sprang to her feet and rushed over. Put him down this instant, she commanded, he's too hurt to ride. Quiet, girl, grunted Arngeir. The old Arthurian turned to Algar's father and ordered him to leave. The man nodded and wheeled his horse around. He rode with half of the other riders joining him. Tilla looked on and cringed. She thought of what Algar would be suffering as he was bumped and jostled on his way home. I hope my bindings hold, she thought as she turned back to face Arngeir. You are cruel, she spat at him. And you are an insolent girl who forgets her place, he replied. Now shut up and go back to tending the wounded. You have no right to speak to her like that, shouted Crest. And you had no right to all but murder my poor grandson, snorted the old man. All but murder, echoed Crest, it was your poor grandson that tried to murder me. Looked at us and see for yourself. Crest motioned to Eric, whose left arm was in a sling, and to Daniel, who had removed his helmet to show his black eye. Arngeir studied them for a moment before he snorted and smiled. If that is the extent of your wounds at Algar's hands, he said, then count yourselves lucky. We only got these wounds after your sainted grandson broke the rules and attacked us, snapped Daniel. It was at that moment that Arngeir noticed that Daniel wasn't wearing any of the tribal colors. The boy's not one of us, he thought as he glared down at him. Who are you? He barked, answer me. He's Daniel Argonaut, answered Crest before Daniel could say anything. He's one of the companions of the 2 foretold by Draco Rex, added Eric. I am also the one who beat Algar, Daniel found himself saying before he could stop himself. He regretted speaking almost as soon as the words left his mouth. Arngir's face was unreadable, but Daniel knew that he must have been very angry. He gazed down at Daniel with his harsh hawk-like eyes. "Come here, boy. I want to give you something," he ordered curtly. Daniel found himself obeying and was soon standing next to the old Arthurian. "What do you want, sir?" he asked, his voice trembling ever so slightly. "This," snarled the old man as he swatted Daniel across the face with his leather riding gloves. The force of the blow stunned Daniel and flopped on his side, his cheeks smarting from the impact. Almost as soon as he fell, he heard Carla roaring and a sound of a huge mace-like fist punching something. While the big Arthurian chieftain had been speaking to Arngir, he had subtly taken hold of the horse's bridle, keeping the animal in place. When Carla saw the old man strike the boy, he roared with rage and punched the horse in the jaw, dealing such a blow that the beast screamed and flipped backwards, throwing its rider. Carla wasted no time and leapt upon the hatful old man, planting his large black boot on the wretch's chest. "I would stay very still if I were you," growled Carla, his teeth bared in a bear-like snarl. Amaron saw this as well, and he stomped up to the group. The horses whinnied and brayed in terror as he approached. He snorted loudly at the mounted Arthurians. Several of them wheeled their steeds around and rode away as quickly as possible. It was impossible for them to not see the displeasure in Amaron's blazing black and amber eyes. "You will not touch my friend again, old man," Amaron rumbled down at Arngir. The old man looked up at the dragon and saw the thin tendrils of smoke rising up from the creature's nostrils. Carla lifted his large foot off the man's chest and stepped away, picking up Daniel with one huge paw. "You all right, boy?" he asked. Daniel rubbed his still smarting cheek and nodded at Carla. "Does he owe me a guild as well?" asked Daniel. "I would say that he owes you a big one," answered Carla. Arngir propped himself on his elbows and looked up at Amaron. There wasn't any terror in the old man's eyes, instead there was a confident air that greatly confused the dragon. Normally anyone who had gotten a dragon angry would be panicking for his life. Then the old man did something that genuinely alarmed Amaron. He smiled and chuckled in bemusement. "And here I thought that you would be bigger," he laughed as the dragon sneered at him. "Really?" snorted Amaron, "what did you expect? An elder bull? No, but I thought that you'd be bigger," replied Arngir. The old man got up and dusted himself off. He appeared totally unconcerned to have Amaron looming over him. The old man's confidence was more than a little disconcerting to Amaron. "He's dealt with dragons before," he thought as he looked down at Arngir. "I give this one warning, little man," rumbled Amaron, the furnace in his chest roiling to life. "If you ever touch a hair on Daniel's head again, you'll want." Arngir interrupted, "Kill me, eat me, tear me in half, crush me underfoot, or will you simply roast me to death and be done with it?" Amaron's eyes narrowed as he let out a long hiss. "I will, so help me, if you ever dare to strike my friend again," he growled. "No you will not," replied the old man, "you won't dare lay a claw on me." "And why wouldn't I?" asked Amaron, feeling the limits of his patience beginning to strain. "Because I am noble-born and hold high rank is why," replied Arngir. Amaron snorted at this. Whether out of bemusement or annoyance was hard to say. "If you harm me," Arngir went on, "then you will be declaring war on all my kinsfolk who will swear to avenge me." "Not all your kinsfolk, great-granduncle," interjected Emmett. "I did not expect any family loyalty from you, great-grandnephew," replied Arngir with a sneer, "but the rest of our great clan will avenge me." "Will avenge you?" echoed Amaron, "it almost sounds as though you expect me to kill you." "And perhaps I do," replied Arngir, "for I know what fire burns within your heart. Your race burns from the inside out and can only find relief when you are killing." A heavy silence hung over them. Man and dragon stared one another down with hard looks burning in their eyes. "Clearly you are mad and not worth my time," sniffed Amaron and then turned away. Arngir shot to his feet incensed. "Don't you turn your back on me, dragon," he cried. "Many a monster have regretted that." Amaron snorted again and walked away. "Are you listening to me, monster?" the man growled. Amaron continued walking. "Dragon," shouted Angria, "will you shut up, uncle?" "You will not talk to me like that," growled Arngir, pointing his finger in Emmett's face. "I will talk to you however I like," Emmett said in a commanding voice. "There are some days, uncle, where you forget who your chieftain is." "Oh, I have never forgotten, nephew," replied Arngir, "but you forget who your elders are. I have lived far longer than you and have seen much more of the world. You forget that I was an old man when your father was born." Errol wouldn't have forgotten my age, nor would he have treated me with such disrespect. If my father was still alive, Arngir, said Emmett, he would have speared you the second you laid a finger on that boy. He's not the only one who would have speared you, rumbled Carla as he stepped up to them, cracking his giant knuckles. Do you intend to strike me further? Asked Arngir. If you ever hit another boy again, growled Carla, I'll relieve you of the burden of your head. I'd love to see you try, laughed the old man. Carla snarled and advanced towards him. But before he could lay a finger on him, Emmett grabbed the big Arthurian and held him back. If I were you, I would go before your tongue digs your pit any deeper, warned Emmett. Arngir looked at the two chieftains, his hawk-like features scowling. He turned to remount his horse, who had gotten back onto its hooves. Surprisingly, the beast was no worse for wear and was eager to gallop away from the dragon. Arngir put his foot in the stirrup but then paused. He looked back over his shoulder at Daniel and sniffed. He turned back to his horse, untied a small leather sack from the saddle and tossed it at the boy's feet. It fell heavily and made a metallic clinking sound. That should cover both my grandson's shameful act and my offense against this human pup, he grumbled as he mounted. The old man wheeled his horse around and spurred him to a gallop. His riders that had remained by his side turned about and followed him. Daniel had picked up the bag and held it in his hands. It was roughly the size of a soccer ball and it felt very heavy. Daniel undid the drawstrings that closed it and almost dropped it when he saw what was inside. Gold, silver, beautiful coins of different shapes and sizes. Daniel's eyes nearly bulged out of their sockets. He had never seen so much treasure in his life. He picked out one particularly large coin and held it between his left thumb and forefinger. There was the profile of a bearded man etched on one side and on the other was a depiction of a mountain. I could buy up everything single last comic book in Mr. Jenkins' candy store with this thing, he said to himself as he gazed at it. No, sod that. I could buy the whole store with it. Both Crest and Eric walked up to Daniel, their eyes dazzling at the sight of the gold. Crest took the large coin from Daniel's hand and bit into it. That's pure gold, he said, and I do believe that this is also a dwarvish mark. This is worth 3 times what a normal shekel will get you. How many more of them are there? Asked Eric. The boys looked at each other and grinned greedily. Daniel turned the bag upside down and dumped the coins onto the ground. They began sorting through the treasure and were surprised to find that there were many different kinds of currency mixed together. They found coins that had been minted by the Arthurians, dwarves, elves, sand children and even some that had been issued by the ancient Sulian Empire. The boys were utterly engrossed by this windfall. We're rich, cried Crest, we're all rich. There's enough for everyone, cheered Eric, momentarily forgetting his wounded collarbone and bruised ankle. The boys of both fur soon gathered around him as they counted the money. There was a glint in their eyes as they gazed at the lovely gold and silver. Had any of them glanced up at that moment, they would have seen Amaron gazing over at them with a confused look on his face. He sniffed the air and cringed in puzzlement. He could smell the gold and he could also smell another scent along with it, a scent that only his kind could sense. The whelpling sniffed the air as well and chirped loudly in surprise. Dragon gold, Amaron said to himself. How did that miserable old husk get his hands on dragon gold? But Amaron already knew the answer. He looked in the direction that Arngir had ridden and bared his teeth in a snarl. Draka Sleu, he rumbled in his native draconic tongue.